Hi class, this is your instructor, Scholar Huff, and welcome to the first chapter. This is chapter 1, the science of biology. So in this chapter, what you're going to be learning about is just a big introduction to biology. So the way we'll do that is we'll begin with the diversities of life in our first section. We'll then get to the properties of life and how life is organized, and then we'll get to those major biological themes. And then from there, we'll end things with the scientific process and those last core ideas of biology. So as things starts, here is that definition that I pretty well think that everyone has heard by now. That definition of what biology is. So biology is the study of living things. It is that science of life. So with that being the case, the living world, as your textbook tells you, is teeming with breathtaking diversity of a variety of creatures, such as whales, which also include pine trees, which there are a lot of pine trees around the southeastern United States, bacteria, which we cannot see with the naked eye, algae, which is one of the basic properties of all aquatic life, including mushrooms, and just all of which are categorized into 6 groups or kingdoms. So since everything here on Earth is so diverse, what is here on Earth in its diversity must be then grouped into kingdoms. So those 6 groups or kingdoms of organisms or living things. So organisms that are placed into a kingdom possess similar characteristics with all other organisms in that same kingdom and are very different from organisms in other kingdoms. So by saying it this way, they're in separate groups just as we would group things all day of our lives. So here we go. So biologists, they study the diversity of life in many different ways. So they live with gorillas, they collect fossils, they isolate bacteria, and study molecules of heredity, which we'll get to in later chapters. So in the midst of all of this diversity, it's easy to lose sight of the key lesson of biology, which is that all living things have so much in common. So we'll begin at the top left. Those that we see at the top left are from the archaea. So kingdom archaea includes prokaryotes, which have simple cells that do not have nuclei, which includes the methanogens, which manufacture methane. So from left to right, we're now in the center, and in the center we have bacteria. So with kingdom bacteria, there are 2 prokaryotic kingdoms. So we have kingdom archaea, and now we have kingdom bacteria, the top left and that in the center top. So shown here are purple sulfur bacteria, which are able to convert light energy into chemical energy. Now on to that last picture on the top row. And what we see here is an example of a protist. So this is kingdom protista. Most of the unicellular eukaryotes, those whose cells contain a nucleus, are grouped into kingdom protista. So here you're seeing multicellular algae. Now at the bottom left, this is kingdom fungi, and this kingdom contains those non-photosynthetic organisms which are mostly which are mostly multicellular. The one that is unicellular are those unicellular yeasts. But of course, they digest their food externally, such as the mushrooms you see. Now in the center bottom, that is a plant, so this is kingdom plantae. This kingdom contains photosynthetic multicellular organisms that are primarily terrestrial, such as the flowering plants you see. And lastly, at the bottom right, will be kingdom Animalia. So organisms in this kingdom are non-photosynthetic, multicellular organisms that digest their food internally, such as the bighorn ram you see. So now to the properties of life. So here, now that you've listed those 6 kingdoms of life, let's now name and describe the 5 basic properties shared by all living things. So if you ask, all right, how do you know whether or not something is living? Well, is it complex? Does it move? And does it respond to its environment? So biology being the study of life, but of course, let's get to what life is. So this is not a simple question as far as what defines the living organisms, because it seems that some of the most obvious properties of living organisms are also properties of many non-living things, such as complexity, meaning a computer is quite complex. Thanks a lot, generative artificial intelligence. Movement, yet also a characteristic of something that is non-living, such as the clouds that move in the sky. And we get lots of those clouds around here along with the rain. And then lastly, the response to stimulation or their environment. So a soap bubble will most definitely pop upon being touched. So to appreciate why the three properties so common among living things do not help us to find life, so let's imagine a mushroom standing next to a television. The TV seems more complex than the mushroom. The picture on the TV screen moves while the mushroom just, well, stands there. So the TV responds to a remote control while the mushroom continues to just stand there. Yet it is the mushroom that is alive. So all living things share these 5 basic properties. Let's begin. Cellular organization. So all living things are comprised of at least one cell. So that cell is that tiny compartment with a thin covering known as a membrane. So some cells have simple interiors, while others are complexly organized, but are able to grow and reproduce. Metabolism. So all living things must use energy. So moving, growing, thinking, everything you do requires energy, even listening to this lecture right now. So where does all this energy come from? It is captured from sunlight by plants and algae and certain bacteria and used to build sugars in a process known as photosynthesis. So to get the energy that powers our lives, we extract it from plants and from animals that eat plants or that eat plant-eating animals. Yeah, that is a connection. So metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions that occur within cells and involves the transfer of energy from one form to another. We're now at homeostasis. So while the environment often varies a lot, organisms act to keep their interior conditions relatively constant in a process known as homeostasis, meaning that all living things that maintain that relatively stable internal environment to optimize conditions for metabolism and other processes. So our bodies act to maintain an internal temperature of about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit, regardless of how cold, which is quite hot outside today, or how hot the cold weather might be. And depending on semester, it may not be cold at all. But right now it is cold as possible in this office. So next up, I'll get to what is called number 4, which is growth and reproduction. So all living things grow and reproduce. Bacteria increase in size and simply split in two. So as often as it happens, it's as little as 15 minutes for every division of cells in some bacteria. So more complex organisms, they grow by increasing the number of cells and reproduce sexually by producing gametes, sperm, and eggs that combine, giving rise to offspring. And lastly is heredity. So all organisms possess a genetic system that is based on a long molecule known as DNA or deoxyribonucleic acid. So the information that determines what an individual organism will be like is contained in a code that is dictated by the order of subunits making up the DNA molecule. Just as the order of letters on this page determines the sense of what you're reading, each set of instructions within DNA is called a gene. So DNA is faithfully copied from one generation to the next, so that any change in a gene is preserved and passed on to future generations. So this transmission of characteristics from parent to offspring is known as heredity. So given these, I hope that this is quite clear. So next up will be the third section called the organization of life with levels of organization. So what we'll do here is list those 13 hierarchical levels of the organization of life. So it may have been the most important property of life being organization. And with that, living things are also very complex, but quite ordered in the way that complexity is. So the key understanding of the organization of living things is to appreciate that they exhibit different levels of complexity. And they are layered one on top of another, like layers of paint, or even layers of a cake if you happen to ever have eaten cake or like to eat cake. So here, let's examine the complexity of life at 3 levels: the cellular level, the organismal level, and then at the population level. So let's begin at the cellular level. So at the cellular level, what we see here is that first, the most simplest part would be the atom. It's that fundamental element of matter. So those atoms, be it hydrogen, nitrogen, and even carbon, they come together then to make up what are called molecules, i.e., atoms are joined together into complex clusters called molecules, such as the molecule of adenine being shown to you there. Next, we'll get to the macromolecules. So these are large, complex molecules, such as DNA, which stores hereditary information. But there's not just DNA, but we could also mention one being called RNA, which is there to specify proteins. So those are two different macromolecules, and we could go further with either the lipids being a second type, as opposed to being DNA or an RNA. We could also refer to those being proteins as a third type of macromolecule, and the fourth and final type is the carbohydrate. Next, organelles. So organelles are known as complex biological molecules, which are assembled into tiny compartments within cells, such as the nucleus, which stores the DNA we mentioned before. So the nucleus is an example of a cell organelle. Another example would be the mitochondrion. A third example would be the chloroplast, all of which are examples of cell organelles. And then lastly, here at the cell level, we're at the cell. So organelles and other elements are assembled into membrane-bound units we call cells. So cells are the smallest level of organization that be considered alive. That is where life begins. Next, we're at the organismal level. So at the organismal level, we'll begin with the tissue. So tissues are the most basic level, which are groups of similar cells that carry out a specific or particular function. So nerve tissue is one kind of tissue and is composed of cells known as neurons that carry what are known as electrical signals. There are 4 other basic types of tissues in animals, but we'll get to those a lot later. Next, we get to organs. So tissues are grouped into organs, which are body structures composed of several different tissues that form a structural and functional unit. Your brain is an organ composed of nerve cells and a variety of tissues that form protective coverings and distribute blood. Next up, we'll get to number 8, the organ system. So organ systems are that third level of organizations. So organs are grouped into organ systems, such as the nervous system. So it consists of sensory organs, the brain, and spinal cord. So neurons convey signals throughout the body and supporting cells. And lastly here, we're at the organismal level. So here, organ systems function together to form an organism. Now, lastly, we'll get to the population level. So we're really stepping up now. So a population is that most basic group of organisms of the same species which live in the same place. I'll repeat, a population is a group of organisms of the same species living in the same place, such as a flock of geese living together on a pond. And you may see those from time to time, the Canada geese, Branta canadensis. Next up is the species level. So all the populations of a particular kind of organism together form a species. So its members are similar in appearance and they are able to interbreed, forming fertile, viable offspring. So again, the Canada geese from Branta canadensis, or even the sandhill crane. So each of those, the Canada geese and sandhill crane, are different species. So next is the community. So here, at this higher level of biological organization, the community consists of all of the populations of different species living together in one place. So geese may share that pond with ducks, or even bass, or even brim, or even catfish, not to mention the grasses and a number of insects, both those which are aquatic and those that are terrestrial. And lastly, the ecosystem level. So at the ecosystem, it's that highest level or highest tier of biological organization. So this is a biological community, and the soil and water within which it lives together constitute an ecological system or ecosystem. So from here, we're now going to get into the emergent properties. So at each, well, before I go to at each, what I'll say is here you will explain the origin of the emergent properties. So at each level in the living hierarchy, there are novel properties which emerge. The properties that were not present at those simpler levels. So the emergent properties result from the way in which components interact and are the natural consequence of the hierarchy and structural organization of life. So functional properties emerge from more complex organization. So metabolism is an emergent property of life. The chemical reactions within a cell arise from interactions between molecules that are orchestrated by the orderly environment of the cell's interior. So consciousness is an emergent property of the brain that results from the interactions of many neurons in different parts of the brain. So now we've gotten to those emergent properties. Let's now get to biological themes, and we're almost to the end of the chapter. So here, you'll explain the 5 general themes that define biology as a science. First up is evolution. So evolution, as defined, is genetic change in a species over time. So back in 1859, Charles Darwin, who was an English naturalist, proposed the idea that this change is due to a result of a process called natural selection. Simply stated, organisms whose characteristics make them better able to survive the challenges of their environment, to live, to reproduce, passing on their favorable characteristics onto their offspring. So again, I say, what natural selection states is that organisms whose characteristics make them better able to survive the challenges of their environment live to reproduce, passing on their favorable characteristics to their offspring. So Darwin was thoroughly familiar with the variation in domesticated animals and many non-domesticated organisms as well. He knew that varieties of pigeons could be selected by breeders to exhibit exaggerated characteristics, a process called artificial selection. So you can see some of these extreme-looking pictures in your textbook on page 22. And that is what comes from artificial selection. So we know that the characteristics selected for are passed on through generations because DNA is transmitted from parent to offspring. So Darwin visualized how selection in nature could be similar to that which had produced different varieties of pigeons. Thus, the many forms of life we see about us on Earth each day, and the way we ourselves are constructed and function reflect a long history of natural selection. Next is the flow of energy. So all organisms require to carry out activities of living to build bodies and do work and think thoughts. All of the energy used by most organisms come from the sun and is passed in one direction through ecosystems. So the simplest way to understand the flow of energy through the living world is to just look at who uses it. The first stage of the energy's journey is its capture by green plants, the algae, and some bacteria by the process of photosynthesis. This process uses energy from the sun to synthesize sugars that are photosynthetic organisms like plants to store in their bodies. So plants then serve as a source of life, driving energy for animals that eat them. So other animals, like the eagle, again shown on page 22, may then eat the plant eaters. At this stage, some energy is for the process of living. At each stage, some energy is used for the process of living, some energy is transferred, and more importantly, much energy is lost, primarily as heat, to entropy. So the flow of energy is a key factor in shaping ecosystems, affecting how many and what kinds of organisms live in a community. So next up is going to be cooperation. So the ants cooperating in the photo you see on page 23, they protect the plant on which they live from predators by shading other plants while the plant returns the favor by providing the ants with nutrients. The yellow structures on the tips of the leaves are the nutrients for the ants to eat. So this type of cooperation has played a critical role in the evolution of life on Earth. For example, organisms of two different species that live in direct contact, such as the ants and the plant on which they live, form a type of relationship known as symbiosis. So symbiosis is when those many types of animals or plants, or animals and plants, or even animals, plants and fungi, have a relationship in which, well, they both benefit. So many types of cells possess organelles that are direct descendants from symbiotic bacteria, and symbiotic fungi help plants first invade land from the sea. So it's the coevolution of flowering plants and insects, in which changes in flowers influence insect evolution, and in turn changes the insects influenced the flower evolution, which has been responsible for much of life's great diversity. Next are structures which determine function. So one of the most obvious lessons of biology is that biological structures are very well suited to their functions. You will see at every level of organization enzymes, which are macromolecules that cells use to carry out chemical reactions, are precisely structured to match shapes of chemicals the enzymes first manipulate. Within many kinds of organisms in the living world, body structures seem carefully suited to carry out their functions. The long tongue with which the mouth to carry sucks nectar from the deep inside of a flower is one example. And you can see that photo again on page 23. The superb fit of the structure to function in the living world is no accident. Life has existed on Earth for over 2 billion years, a long time for evolution to favor changes that better suit organisms to meet the challenges of living. It should come as no surprise to you that after all this honing and adjustment, biological structures carry out their functions well. Next, we have homeostasis, our last theme. The high degree of specialization we see among complex organisms is possible only because these organisms act to maintain a relatively stable internal environment, a process we earlier called homeostasis. Without this constancy, many of the complex interactions that need to take place within organisms would be impossible. Maintaining homeostasis in a body as complex as yours requires a great deal of signaling back and forth between cells. For example, homeostasis involves water balance to maintain proper blood chemistry. All complex organisms need water. Some, like this hippo, luxuriate in it. And you can see the hippo on page 23 at the bottom right. Others, like the kangaroo, or like the kangaroo rat, that lives in arid conditions where water is scarce, obtain water from food and never actually drink. So you will encounter these 5 biological themes repeatedly through this text, but just as a budding architect must learn more than the parts of buildings, so your study of biology should teach you more than just a list of themes and concepts and parts of organisms, because biology is dynamic. It's a dynamic science that will affect your life in many ways, and that lesson is very fundamental respect that most important you will learn. So next up, we'll get to stages of a scientific investigation. So here you explain how the 6 stages of a scientific investigation allows biologists to discover general principles by careful examination of specific cases. So science is not simply a matter of asking questions. The sort of questions that are asked and how they're asked are critical to the scientific investigation. And that's to any scientific investigation. So how is science done? That is our question. Scientists establish general principles as a way to explain the world around us. But how do scientists determine which general principles are true from among the many that might be? So they do this by systematically testing alternative proposals. If these proposals prove inconsistent with the experimental observations, they are rejected as untrue. So, as it happens, after making careful observations concerning a particular area of science, scientists construct a hypothesis, which is a suggested explanation that accounts for the observations. So, it is an educated guess. A hypothesis is a proposition that might be true. So, those hypotheses that have not yet been disproved are retained. They are useful because they fit the known facts, but they are always subject to future rejection in light of new information. So we call the test of a hypothesis an experiment. To evaluate alternative hypotheses, you would conduct an experiment designed to eliminate one or more hypotheses. Note that this does not prove that any of the other hypotheses are untrue. It merely demonstrates that one of them is not. A successful experiment is one that is one or more of the alternative hypotheses is demonstrated to be inconsistent with the results and is thus rejected. So in this text, you will encounter a great deal of information, often accompanied by explanations. So these explanations are hypotheses that have withstood the test of experiment. Many will continue to do so. Others will be revised as new observations are made. So biology, like all science, is in a constant state of change, and with new ideas appearing and replacing the old ones. So let's get now to the scientific process by way of these 6 stages. Scientific investigations can be said to have 6 stages, which are observing what is going on, forming a set of hypotheses, making predictions, testing them out, and then carrying out controls until one or more of the hypotheses have been eliminated, and then forming conclusions based on the remaining hypotheses. So to better understand how a scientist progresses through these stages, let's examine the actual scientific investigation, the discovery and analysis of the ozone hole. 1 is observation. The key to any successful scientific investigation is careful observation. Scientists have studied the skies over the Antarctic for many years, noting 1,000 details about temperature, light, and levels of chemicals. Had these scientists not kept careful records of what they observed, they may not notice that levels of atmospheric gas, ozone, were dropping. Next is the hypothesis. When an unexpected drop in ozone was reported, scientists made a guess why. Perhaps something was destroying the ozone. The culprit was CFCs, chlorofluorocarbons, an industrial chemical used as a coolant in air conditioners, propellants in aerosols, and foaming agents in making styrofoam. Of course, this was not a guess in the true sense. Scientists had some working knowledge of CFCs and what they might be doing in the upper atmosphere. So we call such a guess a hypothesis. So what the scientists guessed was that the chlorine from the breakdown of CFCs was reacting chemically with the ozone over the Antarctic, converting ozone into oxygen gas and removing the ozone shield from our Earth's atmosphere. So in this happening, the scientists had a hypothesis, and then they came up with alternative hypotheses, predictions. If the CFC hypothesis were correct, then several consequences can be reasonably expected. So the expected consequences are known as predictions. And then testing. Scientists set out to test the CFC hypothesis by attempting to verify some of its predictions. We call the test of a hypothesis an experiment. To test the hypothesis, atmospheric samples were collected from the stratosphere over 6 miles up high in altitude, an altitude balloon. And then analysis of the sample revealed the presence of CFCs as predicted. Controls. Events in the upper atmosphere can be influenced by many factors. We call each factor that might influence a process a variable. So to evaluate alternative hypotheses about one variable, all other variables must be kept constant so we do not get misled or confused by the other influences. So it's done by carrying out two experiments in parallel. Lastly is the conclusion. So by way of the conclusion, a hypothesis that has been tested and not rejected is tentatively accepted. The hypothesis that CFCs released into the atmosphere are destroying the Earth's protective ozone shield is now supported by a great deal of experimental evidence and is widely accepted. A collection of related hypotheses that have been tested many times and not rejected are known as a theory. So a theory indicates a high degree of certainty. However, in science, nothing is certain. And now we're getting into theory and certainty. So you all will distinguish between a hypothesis and a theory. Let us begin. So the term theory means different things to different audiences. To the general public, a theory may be something that means a lack of knowledge or even a guess. To scientists, a theory represents certainty, and it is a unifying explanation for a broad range of observations. So given that, a theory is a unifying explanation for that broad range of observations. Thus, we speak of a theory, we speak of the theory of gravity, the theory of evolution, the theory of the atom. Theories are a solid ground of science, the solid ground of science, of that which are the most certain. However, there is no absolute truth in science, only varying degrees of uncertainty. So a scientist's acceptance of the theory is always provisional because of the possibility always remains that the future evidence will cause theory to be revised. Some once accepted theories are discussed in figure 1.7, which is on the left-hand side of page 26. One of which is that the Earth was flat. It was generally accepted until about 330 BC, when Aristotle provided observational evidence for a spherical Earth using constellations. About 100 years later, quantitative evidence was provided by estimating the circumference of the Earth. So there are so many different theories, and I would hope that you all visit those theories on page 26. So the word theory is thus used very differently by scientists than the general public. So to a scientist, a theory represents that of which he or she is most certain. But again, as mentioned moments ago, the word theory to the general public just implies a lack of knowledge or even a guess. So, next I'll mention the scientific method. So it was once a fashionable claim that the scientific progress is the result of applying a series of steps called the scientific method. That is, a series of steps, logical either or predictions, tested by experiments or rejected by one alternative. So the assumption that trial and error testing would be inevitably lead to through the maze of the uncertainty that always slows scientific progress. So if this were indeed true, a computer would make a good scientist, but science is not done this way. If you ask successful scientists how they do their work, you will discover that, without exception, they design experiments with a pretty fair idea of how they will come out. So a hypothesis is a hypothesis that a successful scientist tests not just any hypothesis. Rather, it's not just a hunch or an educated guess in which the scientist integrates all that he or she knows in an attempt to get a sense of what might be true. It is because insight and imagination play a large role that some scientists are much better at scientists than others, just as Beethoven or Mozart stand out among composers. So, The limitations of science. Scientific study is limited to organisms and processes that we are able to observe and measure. Supernatural or religious hypotheses are beyond the realm of science, or beyond the realm of scientific analysis, because they cannot be scientifically studied or analyzed or even explained. So supernatural hypotheses can only be used to explain any result and cannot be disproven by experiment or observation. So scientists in their work are limited to the objective interpretations of observable phenomena. So there are limitations to science. And there are also practical limits. So now we're to the 4 theories that unify biology as a science. So the first we'll get to is the cell theory. So all organisms are composed of at least one cell. The cell is the most basic unit of life, and all cells come or arise from pre-existing cells. That is the cell theory. So this comes from a number of scientists, which I'll mention now. So cells were discovered by Hooke in England in 1665. That's Robert Hooke. So he was using one of the first microscopes that magnified 30 times. Looking through a thin slice of cork, he observed many tiny chambers, which reminded him of a monk's cells in a monastery. Not long thereafter came Leeuwenhoek. So Anton van Leeuwenhoek used microscopes capable of magnifying 300 times and discovered an amazing world of single-celled life in a drop of pond water, such as you see in figure 1.8 on page 28. And then came Schleiden, Matthias Schleiden, and Theodor Schwann. So I say sometimes Schwann and Schleiden. So they summarized a large number of observations by themselves and others and concluded that all organisms consist of cells. I repeat, all living organisms consist of cells. And their conclusion forms the basis of what is now known as the cell theory. So from here, we'll get to gene theory with molecules and inheritance. So even the simplest cell is incredibly complex, more intricate than a computer. The information that specifies what a cell is like, its detailed plan, is encoded in a long cable-like molecule called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. Each DNA molecule is formed by 2 long chains of building blocks called nucleotides, and they are wound around each other. You can see this in figure 1.9 on page 28. So the 2 chains face each other like 2 lines of people holding hands. The chains contain information in the same way the sentence does, as a sequence of letters. There are 4 different nucleotides symbolized as A, T, G, and C. The sequence in which they occur encodes the information. Specific sequences of several hundred to many thousand nucleotides make up a gene, which is a discrete unit of hereditary information. So all organisms encode their genes into strands of DNA. So the gene theory states that the proteins encoded by an organism's gene determines what it will be like. So it's going to be one gene will be determining a singular protein or polypeptide. So this shows gene theory. Now on to the theory of heredity. The storage of hereditary information in genes is composed of DNA is common to all living things. So this was posted, or at least put forth by Gregor Mendel, as that theory of heredity. And it states that the genes of an organism are inherited as discrete units. So a triumph of experimental science developed long before genes and DNA were understood. So Mendel's theory of heredity, which you will learn about in the 10th chapter, soon after Mendel's theory gave rise to the field of genetics. And other biologists propose what has become known as the chromosomal theory of inheritance, which is the simplest form, which in its simplest form states that the genes of Mendel's theory are physically located on a chromosome, and it's because chromosomes are parceled out in a regular manner during reproduction that Mendel's regular patterns of inheritance are seen. So these two theories, that genes are a component of a cell's chromosome, and the regular duplication of these chromosomes during sexual reproduction, is responsible for the pattern of inheritance we call Mendelian segregation. And now to the theory of evolution, known as the diversity of life. So the unity of life we see in the retention of certain key characteristics among many related life forms contrasts with the incredible diversity of living things that have evolved. These diverse organisms are sorted through by biologists into 6 kingdoms, as you all learned earlier in the first section of the chapter. So organisms are then placed in the same kingdom, have in common general characteristics. In recent years, biologists have had a classification level above kingdoms based on the fundamental differences in cell structure. The 6 kingdoms are now assigned into one of 3 great groups called domains. So there is domain bacteria, domain archaea, and domain eukarya. Please see figure 1.12. You will see this on page 30. Bacteria and archaea each consist of one kingdom of prokaryotes. These are single-celled organisms with little internal structure. 4 more kingdoms composed of organisms with more complexly organized cells are placed within the domain the eukaryotes. So the kingdoms of life are discussed further in the 15th chapter. So with this theory of evolution, advanced by Charles Darwin, it attributes that the diversity of the living world to natural selection. So those organisms best able to respond to the challenges of living will leave more offspring, he argued, and thus their traits become more common in the population. It is because the world offers diverse opportunities that it contains so many different life forms. So today scientists can decipher all the genes, i.e. the genome, of an organism. So one of the great triumphs of science in the century and a half since Darwin is the detailed understanding of how Darwin's theory of evolution is related to gene theory, and how changes in life's diversity result from changes in individual genes. So there we have it, the diversity of life, the theory of natural selection. So this class has been what is called Chapter 1. If you have any questions, please feel free to come to the end of your chapter where it says putting the chapter to work. As you put the chapter to work, it goes through and reviews what you learned in the chapter. You should also see at the end of the chapter the retracing the learning path to go back through everything you all have learned. And then lastly, the inquiry and analysis questions are definitely great review. So this has been your instructor, Skylar Huff. Thank you for listening to Chapter 1.